The sun beat down on the sprawling Texas landscape as Chuck Norris sat on the porch of his ranch house. A cool breeze rustled the pages of the script he was reading for his upcoming action film. His dogs lounged nearby, occasionally perking up their ears at distant sounds. It was a perfect Sunday afternoon, peaceful and quiet, just the way Chuck liked it after decades in the spotlight. The ringing of his phone broke the silence. Chuck recognized the number. It was Tom Wilson, his attorney and longtime friend. Strange, Tom rarely called on weekends unless something important came up. "Chuck, sorry to bother you on your day off." Tom's voice sounded tense. "No problem. What's going on?" Chuck set his script aside, suddenly alert. "It's about Bobby Jenkins, that veteran who teaches at your martial arts school in Dallas. He's in some serious trouble." Chuck frowned. Bobby was one of his most dedicated instructors, a former Marine who'd found healing through martial arts after returning from overseas with both physical and invisible wounds. After completing Chuck's instructor program, Bobby had devoted himself to teaching self-defense to other veterans struggling with PTSD. "What kind of trouble?" Chuck asked, already standing up, his peaceful afternoon forgotten. "He's been charged with assault after an incident at a local bar. But Chuck, from what I've gathered, he was defending a woman who was being harassed. The other guy has connections with the judge assigned to the case. It smells fishy." Chuck listened as Tom explained how Bobby faced not just legal trouble, but the potential loss of everything he'd worked for. His martial arts teaching license, his reputation, and even his freedom were at stake. The veteran program that helped so many former soldiers might collapse without him. "They're rushing this case through," Tom continued. "Court date is tomorrow morning. Bobby asked if you'd consider coming in as a character witness. I told him it was short notice, but I'll be there," Chuck said without hesitation. "Text me the details." That evening, instead of resting or rehearsing lines, Chuck sat at his desk with law books spread around him. Few people knew about his deep interest in legal matters, a passion he'd developed years ago after a contract dispute early in his career. While most fans saw only the tough guy from the movies, Chuck had spent countless nights studying legal, precedents, and constitutional law, knowledge that had served him well throughout his career. As midnight approached, Chuck was still taking notes, reviewing similar cases, and preparing himself for what might come. Bobby Jenkins wasn't just an employee. He represented everything Chuck believed in: service, honor, and second chances. He wouldn't let the young veteran down. Monday morning arrived with gray clouds threatening rain, fitting weather for what was about to unfold. Chuck arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, dressed in a navy suit that seemed to accentuate the determination in his eyes. Several reporters noticed him entering the building, and whispers spread quickly through the halls. In the courtroom, Bobby sat nervously beside Tom. When he spotted Chuck, relief washed over his face. Chuck gave him a reassuring nod before taking a seat in the first row behind them. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Raymond Hartwell," the bailiff announced. The judge entered, his face set in stern lines. At 67, Judge Hartwell had a reputation throughout the county, and it wasn't a good one. Known for his harsh sentences and impatience with what he called celebrity culture, many lawyers dreaded getting assigned to his courtroom. As the proceedings began, Chuck observed everything with quiet attention. The prosecutor painted Bobby as an aggressive, dangerous man who used his combat training to hurt others. It was a complete mischaracterization of the gentle, troubled veteran Chuck knew. When Tom called Chuck as a character witness, a slight murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Hartwell looked up from his notes, his eyes narrowing as Chuck approached the stand. "State your name for the record," the court clerk instructed. "Carlos Ray Norris, known professionally as Chuck Norris." Judge Hartwell didn't bother hiding his displeasure. "Mr. Norris," he said icily, "I hope you understand that roundhouse kicks don't work in my courtroom. The law doesn't bend for celebrities." Several people gasped at the blatant disrespect. The prosecutor smirked, but Chuck simply nodded respectfully, unruffled by the comment. He'd faced worse in his life, and he knew getting angry would only hurt Bobby's case. "Yes, Your Honor," Chuck replied, his voice calm and measured. I'm here today only as a concerned citizen and as someone who has worked closely with Mr. Jenkins for the past 3 years. The judge's expression remained skeptical, but he motioned for Tom to proceed with his questions. Mr. Norris, can you tell the court about your relationship with Robert Jenkins and your knowledge of his character? Chuck cleared his throat and looked directly at the jury. 12 ordinary people who probably knew him only from television. This wasn't about him or his fame. It was about a good man whose future hung in the balance. Bobby, Robert Jenkins, came to my martial arts school after serving 3 tours overseas. Like many veterans, he was struggling with the transition back to civilian life. He had nightmares, anxiety in crowds, and trouble connecting with people. Chuck paused, making eye contact with several jurors before continuing. What impressed me about Bobby wasn't his fighting skill, though he had plenty. It was his heart. Even while dealing with his own battles, he wanted to help others. He specifically asked to work with our veteran program, teaching self-defense, techniques that help with confidence and anxiety management. As Chuck spoke, even Judge Hartwell seemed to be listening more carefully. The sneer had faded slightly, replaced by something less hostile, perhaps curiosity. In the 3 years I've known him, Chuck continued, I've seen Bobby talk down potential fights, not start them. I've witnessed him spend extra hours with struggling students, often without pay. The man described by the prosecution isn't the Bobby Jenkins I know. The prosecutor stood up, eager to begin cross-examination. Your Honor, may I? Judge Hartwell nodded, his eyes still studying Chuck with a mixture of suspicion and something else, something that might have been the first hint of respect. Mr. Norris, the prosecutor began, his tone condescending. You're not exactly an impartial witness here. Mr. Jenkins works for you. His behavior reflects on your business. Isn't it true that you have a financial interest in portraying him positively? Tense silence fell over the courtroom. Everyone waited for Chuck's response. Would the famous action star lose his cool? Would he give them the angry reaction they were all expecting? Instead, Chuck smiled slightly. Not the smile of his action. Hero characters, but something more thoughtful. The real man behind the legend was about to speak, and what he would say next would change the entire course of the trial. The prosecutor turned his attention back to Chuck, his voice dripping with condescension. Mr. Norris, let's be honest here. You're a Hollywood star who teaches people to kick and punch for a living. Isn't it possible that your school actually encourages aggressive behavior, and Mr. Jenkins was simply following what he learned from you? A hush fell over the courtroom. Even Judge Hartwell seemed surprised by the directness of the attack. The question wasn't just aimed at Bobby Jenkins anymore. It was a direct challenge to Chuck's character and life's work. Chuck took a deep breath before responding. Eyes around the courtroom watched him carefully, waiting for signs of anger or defensiveness. Sir, if I may address your question directly, Chuck began, his voice steady and controlled. His Texas accent became slightly more pronounced, giving his words a warm, genuine quality. Bobby Jenkins doesn't just work for me. He works with me. The veteran program operates as a non-profit branch of our school. I personally take no profit from it. In fact, I help fund it. Chuck leaned forward slightly in his seat. Our first lesson, the very first thing we teach every student who walks through our doors, is that true strength comes from self-control. We train people to defend themselves so they never have to fight. Someone who uses their training to start fights has missed the entire point of what we teach. The prosecutor looked slightly taken aback, clearly having expected an emotional response. He recovered quickly, shuffling through his notes. That's all very noble, Mr. Norris, but you're still not addressing my point. You have a public image to maintain. A violent instructor doesn't look good for your school, does it? You're here to protect your business interests. Several people in the gallery shook their heads, seeing through the prosecutor's tactics. Tom Wilson started to object, but Chuck gave him a small gesture. He wanted to answer this himself. With respect, Chuck replied, meeting the prosecutor's gaze steadily. I've built my reputation over decades. One incident wouldn't damage that. What would damage my reputation would be abandoning someone I know to be of good character when they need help. He paused, letting his next words carry weight. I'm here because Bobby Jenkins is one of the most honorable men I know, not because I'm worried about my school's image." A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom. Judge Hartwell watched this exchange with growing interest. He'd expected the martial arts star to be just another celebrity using fame to influence his courtroom. But there was something unexpectedly genuine about Norris's testimony. "Mr. Norris," the judge interrupted, his tone still carrying skepticism, "your expertise is in fictional fighting and reading scripts someone else wrote. What could you possibly contribute to these serious legal proceedings?" A slight ripple of discomfort moved through the courtroom at the judge's openly hostile tone. Even the court reporter glanced up briefly, surprised by the judge's words. Tom Wilson half rose from his seat to object, but Chuck gave him a small shake of the head. "He could handle this, Your Honor," Chuck began respectfully, removing his reading glasses and setting them on the stand before him. "I understand your skepticism, but I'm not here as an actor or martial artist. I'm here as someone who has spent over 3 years observing Mr. Jenkins in situations of stress, teaching him conflict resolution and watching how he applies those principles." Chuck's voice remained calm, carrying throughout the courtroom without seeming forceful. "I've seen Bobby work with veterans suffering from severe PTSD, men and women who can be triggered by sudden movements or loud noises. In those situations, remaining calm and controlled isn't just good practice, it's absolutely necessary. Bobby has never once lost his composure, even in the most challenging circumstances." The judge's expression remained unconvinced. "Go on," he said, his tone suggesting he expected little of value. "Bobby Jenkins has a core principle that we teach at our school, that fighting is always the last resort, not the first. In 3 years, I've never once seen him lose control, even when provoked. That's why the accusations don't match the man I know." Chuck glanced briefly at Bobby, who sat with perfect posture at the defense table, his military training evident even now. "Your Honor, when a Marine like Bobby is trained, those instincts become second nature. He doesn't need to think about using minimal force. It's automatic. The idea that he would escalate a situation unnecessarily goes against everything I know about him." The prosecutor sensed the shift in the room and quickly jumped in, his voice slightly louder than necessary. "Your Honor, while Mr. Norris's observations are touching, they hardly qualify as expert testimony on this matter." Judge Hartwell nodded, seeming pleased with the prosecutor's intervention. "I tend to agree, Counselor. Mr. Norris, unless you have specific knowledge about the incident in question—" "Actually, Your Honor," Chuck interrupted, keeping his tone respectful but firm, "if I may, there's something that hasn't been mentioned yet that directly relates to Mr. Jenkins's actions that night." The courtroom fell completely silent. The prosecutor looked nervous, shuffling papers to hide his discomfort, while Tom Wilson looked genuinely surprised. This wasn't something they had prepared. What nobody in that courtroom knew was that Chuck had spent the previous night not just reviewing legal precedents, but also personally visiting the bar where the incident occurred. The owner had recognized him immediately, of course, but Chuck had asked for discretion. He had spoken to the bartender who had witnessed everything but hadn't been called to testify. More importantly, he had examined the security camera placement and discovered a blind spot that explained the discrepancy in witness statements. "Your Honor," Chuck continued, "I believe there's evidence that hasn't been presented that would substantially change how the court views this case." Judge Hartwell's eyebrows rose. His expression was a mixture of irritation and curiosity. He tapped his pen against his notepad several times, clearly weighing how to respond. He hadn't expected this turn of events from a celebrity witness. "Mr. Norris," the judge said, leaning forward, his voice lower but carrying an edge, "this is highly irregular. Are you suggesting that you have conducted your own investigation into this matter?" Chuck met the judge's gaze directly, his blue eyes unwavering. "I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that there are witnesses who haven't been heard and video evidence that hasn't been reviewed, and I believe Mr. Jenkins deserves to have all evidence considered before judgment is passed." The courtroom remained silent, the tension almost electric. Bobby Jenkins straightened in his chair, a flicker of hope crossing his face for the first time that day. The prosecutor jumped to his feet, his chair squeaking against the floor. "Your Honor, this is absurd. Mr. Norris is not an investigator or an officer of the court. This is clearly an attempt to ensure justice is served," Chuck finished calmly. "Nothing more." The prosecutor's face flushed red. "Your Honor, I must strongly object to this. This interference from a witness who clearly doesn't understand proper legal procedure." Judge Hartwell studied Chuck for a long moment. This wasn't the shallow celebrity he had expected. There was something more to Chuck Norris than his public persona suggested. After what seemed like an eternity, the judge made his decision. He struck his gavel once, cutting off the prosecutor's continued objections. "Court will recess for 30 minutes while I speak with both counsels in my chambers." He pointed his gavel at Chuck. "And you, Mr. Norris, will join us." As Chuck followed the judge and lawyers toward the chambers, he caught Bobby's eye. The young veteran looked hopeful for the first time since the proceedings began. Chuck gave him a subtle nod. No matter what happened next, he wouldn't stop fighting for the truth. What the judge didn't know was that Chuck had spent not just the previous night but the past 3 days studying the case file, relevant precedents, and the state's legal code. While known worldwide for his martial arts and acting career, few were aware of Chuck's lifelong interest in constitutional law and his private studies in legal theory. As the judge's barbs continued throughout the morning, Chuck had maintained perfect composure, waiting for precisely this moment to speak up. Judge Hartwell's chambers were nothing like the warm, woodsy spaces shown in legal TV shows. The walls were stark white, the furniture modern and uncomfortable. The judge sat behind his desk, the prosecutor to his right, and Tom Wilson to his left. Chuck remained standing until the judge waved impatiently at the remaining chair. "All right, Mr. Norris," Judge Hartwell began, his tone clipped. "You've made quite the claim out there. Care to explain yourself before I decide whether to hold you in contempt?" The prosecutor smirked, clearly expecting Chuck to back down or fumble. Tom Wilson looked worried. This wasn't part of their strategy. Chuck met the judge's stern gaze directly. "Your Honor, after reviewing the case file, I noticed several inconsistencies in the witness statements. The prosecution's main witness claims he had clear visibility of the entire incident, but the bar's layout makes that impossible from where he was standing." The judge frowned. "And how exactly would you know the bar's layout?" "I visited it last night and spoke with the bartender, who was working during the incident. He confirmed that Bobby, Mr. Jenkins, only intervened after the complainant had already physically grabbed a female patron. The bartender wasn't called to testify, despite being the only employee with a direct line of sight to the entire incident." The prosecutor's face reddened. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. Mr. Norris has no authority to conduct his own investigation or interview witnesses." Chuck remained calm. "Any citizen has the right to speak to potential witnesses, as long as there's no intimidation involved. And speaking of rights, Your Honor, with all due respect, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Davis v. Johnson, 1987, which established that character testimony carries significant weight when the witness has direct knowledge of the defendant's responses under duress." The room fell silent. The judge's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. The prosecutor's mouth actually fell open. Even Tom Wilson looked stunned. Chuck continued, his voice steady. "Furthermore, in State v. Reynolds, 1992, the Texas Supreme Court ruled that when evidence suggests incomplete witness testimony may have affected the presentation of facts, the court has an obligation to consider additional witnesses who can provide context to the events in question." Judge Hartwell leaned forward, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by intense focus. "You're citing case law, Mr. Norris?" "Yes, Your Honor. And if I may, Phillips v. Henderson County, 2005, further reinforced this principle, specifically in cases where character witnesses have specialized knowledge relevant to understanding the defendant's actions." Chuck proceeded to methodically reference Richardson v. State, which addressed the burden of proof in cases involving defense of others, and quoted Section 38.23 of the Texas Legal Code that outlined the specific circumstances applicable to Bobby's situation. The prosecutor was now frantically flipping through notes, clearly unprepared for this level of legal argument from someone he'd dismissed as just another celebrity. Tom Wilson's expression had transformed from worry to barely contained amazement. Judge Hartwell removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Norris," he said finally, "I think we need to return to the courtroom and recall some witnesses." He turned to the prosecutor. "And counselor, I want to know why the bartender wasn't on your witness list." As they stood to leave, the judge hesitated, then asked what everyone had been wondering. "Mr. Norris, if you don't mind my asking, how exactly do you know all this legal precedent?" Chuck smiled slightly. "I've had my share of legal issues over my career, Your Honor. I decided long ago it was better to understand the law myself than to rely entirely on others to explain it to me. I've been studying legal theory for almost 20 years now." For the first time that day, Judge Hartwell's expression held something that looked remarkably like respect. "Well," he said with a slight shake of his head, "it seems I may have misjudged you, Mr. Norris." As they returned to the courtroom, Chuck could feel the shift in energy. The spectators sensed something had changed. Bobby looked up questioningly, and Chuck gave him a small, reassuring nod. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time since this ordeal began, the truth had a fighting chance. When court resumed, everything had changed. The bartender had been quickly located and brought in to testify. His account aligned perfectly with Bobby's version of events. The woman who had been harassed that night was also called in and confirmed that Bobby had only intervened after she was grabbed forcefully. But the prosecutor wasn't giving up easily. He objected frequently, trying to restrict the new testimony on procedural grounds. "Your Honor," he argued, "these witnesses weren't on the original list. The defense is attempting to introduce new elements that we haven't had time to properly investigate." Judge Hartwell looked to Tom Wilson, who seemed unsure how to respond. Then, to everyone's surprise, the judge turned to Chuck. "Mr. Norris, since you seem well versed in these matters, do you have thoughts on counsel's objection?" The prosecutor's face flushed with anger. "Your Honor, with all respect, Mr. Norris is not an attorney of record in this case." "I'm well aware of that, counselor," the judge replied dryly. "However, he has demonstrated substantial knowledge of relevant precedent. I'm simply curious about his perspective." Chuck stood respectfully. "Your Honor, while I'm not an attorney, I believe Grayson v. Barton County 1998 addresses this exact situation. The court ruled that when new witnesses are identified during proceedings who have direct knowledge of events in question, justice is better served by hearing their testimony, even if it requires additional time for both sides to prepare." What followed was an unexpected battle of legal minds. Each time the prosecutor attempted to block testimony on procedural grounds, Chuck respectfully suggested relevant case law that supported allowing it. When Judge Hartwell cited a seemingly obscure rule of evidence regarding hearsay, Chuck politely responded by noting the 3 exceptions to that rule, one of which perfectly applied to their current situation. "Your Honor," he said during one exchange, "Weber v. State established that when a witness observes behavior that directly contradicts the prosecution's narrative, their testimony falls under the excited utterance exception to the hearsay rule, making it admissible even if they weren't on the original witness list." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Counsel?" he asked the prosecutor. The prosecutor, previously so confident, now looked both frustrated and embarrassed. "I'm not immediately familiar with that case, Your Honor." "I am," Judge Hartwell replied. "Mr. Norris cited it correctly. The testimony stands." By mid-afternoon, the dynamic in the courtroom had completely transformed. Tom Wilson, initially nervous about having a celebrity witness, now sat back in amazement as Chuck effectively built a legal framework for the defense. The jury members were clearly engaged, several of them taking notes when Chuck spoke. Most impressive was Chuck's ability to maintain absolute respect for the court, while systematically helping dismantle the prosecution's case. He never showed frustration or impatience, even when the prosecutor tried to provoke him with personal comments about his career. "Your Honor," Chuck said during a particularly critical moment, "as established in Richardson v. State, The burden of proof in these circumstances shifts when evidence of prior good character meets the standard set forth in Section 38.23 of the Code. The prosecutor stood up, clearly annoyed. Your Honor, Mr. Norris keeps referring to legal precedents as if he were qualified to interpret them. He's an actor, not a lawyer. This is becoming absurd. Judge Hartwell's response surprised everyone. Counselor, Mr. Norris has cited established precedent correctly at every turn today. His occupation doesn't change the validity of his legal observations. Perhaps instead of questioning his qualifications, you might address the substance of his points. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The prosecutor looked as if he'd been slapped. Bobby Jenkins, who had been watching everything with growing hope, turned to whisper something to Tom Wilson, who nodded with a smile. As the afternoon wore on, more witnesses came forward, including two patrons who had been seated closer to the incident than the prosecution's witness. Their accounts further confirmed Bobby's story. He had stepped in only after the situation had already become physical, and he had used minimal force to separate the aggressive man from the woman he was harassing. Chuck observed it all with quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about winning a legal battle for him. It was about making sure a good man wasn't punished for doing the right thing. It was about making sure that truth prevailed over connections and influence. The morning sun streamed through the courtroom windows, casting long rectangles of light across the polished wooden floor. After days of testimony and legal arguments, a sense of anticipation filled the air. This was it, the moment everyone had been waiting for. Judge Hartwell entered the courtroom, his expression unreadable as he took his seat. The usual all-rise announcement seemed more solemn than usual. Chuck sat calmly beside Tom Wilson, occasionally glancing at Bobby Jenkins, whose military posture couldn't quite hide his nervousness. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the unusual case and the even more unusual legal expertise being displayed by the martial arts legend. Several law students had even started showing up to watch the proceedings, notebooks in hand. Before I announce my decision, Judge Hartwell began, adjusting his glasses. I would like to address certain aspects of this case that deserve special mention. A hush fell over the room. The prosecutor straightened his tie, looking considerably less confident than he had on day one. This court has witnessed something extraordinary over the past few days, the judge continued. We have seen how preconceptions and assumptions can cloud judgment, including my own. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom before settling briefly on Chuck. And we have been reminded that true expertise can come from unexpected sources. The judge took a sip of water, then continued. Based on the testimony of multiple witnesses, the security footage that was finally viewed in its entirety, and the compelling character evidence presented, this court finds Robert Jenkins not guilty of all charges. Bobby's shoulders sagged with relief. Several veterans in the audience exchanged quiet high fives. Tom Wilson turned to Chuck with a grateful smile, but Judge Hartwell wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court recommends that the district attorney's office review how this case was prepared and presented. The oversight in interviewing key witnesses and the selective presentation of video evidence raises concerning questions. The prosecutor's face flushed red as several heads turned his way. Before we conclude today's proceedings, the judge continued, I would like to acknowledge something unusual. He turned toward Chuck. Mr. Norris, when you entered my courtroom earlier this week, I made certain assumptions about your purpose here and your ability to contribute meaningfully to these proceedings. The courtroom grew absolutely silent. Everyone could hear what wasn't being said, that the judge had been openly disrespectful and dismissive. I was wrong, Judge Hartwell stated plainly. The court thanks you for your exceptionally thorough and well-researched testimony. Your preparation and knowledge of the law are impressive. Coming from Judge Hartwell, known throughout the county for his reluctance to praise anyone, these words carried special weight. Chuck simply nodded in acknowledgement, his humble response earning him even more respect from those watching. When court was officially adjourned, people crowded around Bobby and Chuck, offering congratulations and support. One older woman, tears in her eyes, thanked Chuck for helping her son. Bobby's program saved my boy's life after he came back from overseas, she explained. If he'd lost his teaching license over this. She couldn't finish the sentence. Chuck squeezed her hand gently. Your son helped himself by building something worth fighting for. I just made sure the truth was heard. An hour later, most people had cleared out. Chuck was gathering his notes when he realized Bobby was standing nearby, waiting patiently. Got a minute? Bobby asked. Chuck nodded, and they moved to a quiet corner of the now empty courtroom. How did you know? Bobby asked, his voice quiet. About the bartender, the camera angles, all of it? Chuck smiled slightly. Same way I learned to fight, by paying attention to details others miss. The prosecution's story had holes from the beginning. I just needed to find what filled those holes. Bobby nodded, then hesitated. The things you said about the veteran program? About me? Thank you. I only spoke the truth, Chuck replied. And speaking of the program, how soon can you get back to teaching? Those guys need you. Bobby's face lit up. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. sharp. You know veterans, they like the early hours. Good, Chuck said, clasping the younger man's shoulder. That's where you belong. As they walked out together, several reporters were waiting on the courthouse steps, cameras ready. Chuck began to steer Bobby toward a side exit, but the younger man shook his head. It's okay, Bobby said. People should know what happened here. It might help others. They faced the media together, Bobby answering questions with the straightforward manner of a military man, occasionally deferring to Chuck for the more complex legal explanations. When asked about his feelings toward the prosecutor, Bobby simply said, "No hard feelings. Everyone was just doing their job." Chuck was almost to his car when he heard someone calling his name. Turning, he saw Judge Hartwell approaching, having shed his formal robes for a regular suit that somehow made him look more human, less intimidating. "Mr. Norris, do you have a moment?" The two men found a quiet spot away from curious ears. "In 30 years on the bench, I've rarely been so thoroughly educated," Judge Hartwell admitted, his tone genuinely humble. "I made assumptions about you that were clearly unfounded." Chuck simply smiled and offered his hand. "No hard feelings, Your Honor. The law, like martial arts, rewards those who respect it enough to study it deeply." The judge shook his hand firmly. "May I ask, why did you take the time to learn all this? Most people in your position would just hire expensive lawyers and leave the details to them." Chuck looked out across the courthouse lawn, considering the question. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. "When I was starting out in tournaments," he finally said, "I got cheated out of a victory because I didn't understand the scoring rules properly. The referee made a bad call, but I couldn't argue effectively because I didn't know the exact regulations. I promised myself I'd never again lose because I didn't understand the rules of any arena I entered." Judge Hartwell nodded slowly, genuine respect in his eyes. A philosophy more people would benefit from adopting. He hesitated, then added, "The veterans program your school runs. I'd like to learn more about it. I have a nephew who returned from overseas last year. He's having a hard time adjusting. Bring him by the school," Chuck said without hesitation. "Any day next week. Ask for Bobby. He's especially good with newcomers." As the sun began to set, Chuck drove back toward his ranch, windows down, enjoying the cool evening air. His phone had been buzzing with messages, various news outlets wanting interviews, his agent excited about the publicity, and even a few law professors interested in having him speak to their classes. But Chuck's thoughts were elsewhere. He was thinking about the look on Bobby's face when the charges were dismissed, about the veterans who would continue to find healing through the program, about a judge who had been willing to admit he was wrong. 3 weeks later, Chuck was teaching an advanced class when he spotted Judge Hartwell watching from the observation area. Beside him stood a young man in his 20s, thin and nervous looking, with the 1,000-yard stare Chuck had seen too many times before. After class, the judge approached. "Mr. Norris, this is my nephew Peter. He served 2 tours in special operations. We were hoping to talk to Bobby about the veteran program." "Of course," Chuck said, extending his hand to the young man. "Bobby's in the next room. But first, let me show you something." He led them to a wall covered with photographs. Veterans, of different ages, some in wheelchairs, others standing tall, all wearing martial arts uniforms of various belt colors. Every person on this wall came here broken in some way, Chuck explained quietly. Each one found something they needed: discipline, purpose, brotherhood. Some found their way back, others found a new path forward. Peter stared at the photos, recognition dawning in his eyes. These were people like him, people who understood. Can I? He started, then fell silent. Chuck smiled. You already took the hardest step by walking through that door. The rest will come one day at a time. As he watched Peter talk with Bobby later, Chuck felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning a legal battle. A good man had been cleared, a worthy program had been saved, and now another veteran would get the chance to rebuild his life. Within months, the story had spread throughout legal circles across Texas. What began as an attempt to humiliate a celebrity ended as a powerful reminder: never judge someone's intellect by their public persona. The incident even inspired several law schools to invite Chuck to give guest lectures on the importance of personal legal literacy. But the outcome that pleased Chuck most was much simpler. Judge Hartwell's nephew had joined the Veterans Program and was making steady progress. The judge himself had become one of the program's most vocal supporters, helping secure additional funding and facilities. Chuck Norris had once again proven that his greatest strength wasn't his fighting ability or his fame, but his commitment to thorough preparation and quiet excellence in all his endeavors. And sometimes, the most important battles weren't won with fists or kicks, but with knowledge, respect, and an unwavering commitment to doing what's right, no matter who stands in opposition.